Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So if you watched my recent video that I think it's like 2 videos ago, where I do an entire in-depth rant / review on Stephen King's 2014 novel Revival, you might have a sense of what this video is about to be about. I know that it says horror novels I hate by authors that I love. Hate is definitely a very, very strong word in this case. For me, this is just books that I really didn't like by authors that I do generally love, and I'm going to just go into why that is and what I usually expect from that author. I'm going to do a little bit of a summary on these books. But one of the reasons I wanted to film this is because I feel like there are so many times where readers will read one thing from an author and it doesn't click with them, and they might be missing out because they read the wrong book for them. Not every author is always going to produce a 5-star read, and I know with me, I love Stephen King. Again, my whole Revival video talks about this, but I don't love all of his work. I love a vast majority of it, and he is my favorite author, but there are definitely several books that I have read from him that I can't even believe are the same author. Maybe one day I'll do a whole video on Cujo because I cannot stand that book. And I'm so sorry because I know so many people love it, but oh, that's just another one where I'm just like, I can't with Stephen King sometimes. But I do love him, and I never want to discourage people from reading books and discovering new authors and expanding their home libraries. So I thought this would be a really, really fun video to do, to just kind of talk about authors that I do generally really, really adore, and talk about some of their works that didn't work for me. So we're going to talk about 5 books today. I only have 4 of them here, but I will explain why that is as we get through this. But without further ado, let's jump right on in. First up, we are going to talk about Adam L.G. Neville, also known as Adam Neville. He's probably best known for his work, The Ritual. That's definitely the book that made him the most famous. Also very well known for Last Days and No One Gets Out Alive. Both The Ritual and No One Gets Out Alive have been turned into films, I believe both on Netflix. No One Gets Out Alive is my personal favorite thing that Adam Neville has ever written, but he is one of those authors that I feel like can be so hit and so miss. But oddly enough, the very first book I ever read from him was The Reddening. And I read it during the beginning of the shutdowns in 2020, and I was not a fan. But there was something about it, and it might honestly have been because I ordered 2 of his books and I was trapped in a house and had like literally nothing to do but read during this time. But there's something about this book that told me to keep reading his work, and I'm so glad that I did, because if I had just stopped with this one, there was a lot of books I would have missed out on that I do really enjoy from Adam Neville. And I do have his new book upstairs, and I will be reading it hopefully next. I'm currently reading Mr. Lullaby, but that's been sitting like on the top of my TBR pile for a while now. But let's read the premise of this book. 1 million years of evolution didn't change our nature, nor did it bury the horrors predating civilization. Ancient rites, old deities, and savage ways can reappear in the places you least expect. Lifestyle journalist Katrine escaped past traumas by moving to a coast renowned for the seaside holidays and natural beauty. But when a vast hoard of human remains and prehistoric artifacts is discovered in nearby Brickburg, a hideous shadow engulfs her life. Helena, a disillusioned lone parent, lost her brother Lincoln 6 years ago. Disturbing subterranean noises he recorded prior to vanishing draw her to the Brickburg's caves, the site where early humans butchered each other across 60,000 years. Upon the walls, images of their nameless gods remain. Amidst rumors of drug plantations and new sightings of the mythical red folk, it also appears that the inquisitive have been disappearing from the remote part of the world for years. A rural idyll where outsiders are unwelcome and where an infernal power is believed to linger beneath the earth, a timeless supernormal influence that only the desperate would dream of confronting. But to save themselves and those they love, and to thwart a crimson tide of pitiless barbarity, Kat and Helena are given no choice. They were involved and condemned before they knew it. Okay, so that was a very wordy back of the book. And that was actually my hardest hump to get over when reading this. It was so verbose and overly descriptive and just written in a way that was really, really challenging for me to get into. which luckily is something that Neville doesn't really do in his earlier works. Last Days, No One Gets Out Alive, The Ritual, none of those stories feature this kind of dense writing, but a lot of his newer work does. One of the things I love about Adam Neville is he always writes really, really great folk horror. And he's very, very good at writing scary. And one of the things that I will say about this book is there is a scene in this book that is so absolutely terrifying. It has to do, I believe, with Katrine's boyfriend. I believe it's Katrine. And I just remember reading it and being like, oh my god, this guy can write really horrific, unnerving, unsettling scenes. And it really was just terrifying to read. And that, I think, is actually what kept me wanting to know more from Neville, because while I hated the language in this, and I really hated all of our main characters, I did really like the kind of folklore that he had introduced. I loved the cult that was in this. I loved this concept of folk horror. I just didn't love the writing that was used to sell this story to me. So yeah, if you are somebody who has read The Reddening and you absolutely hated it, I promise Neville's more famous works are definitely very different than this, but a lot of his newer works fit more into this kind of very, very verbose storyline. I know that he's tried really hard to like kind of write his books as if they were screenplays recently, and I don't necessarily know if I love that style for him. It definitely takes away, I would say, from some of his like internal characterizations, and just kind of pushing the narrative forward, and in turn is really highlighting these kind of overly descriptive, unnecessary moments in his stories, which definitely drag the book down. So while I do really enjoy Adam Neville, and I will pick up all of his releases as they come out continuously, this book just did not do it for me. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about Darcy Coates. I love me some Darcy Coates. She's one of my favorite authors. I love her cozy horror. I literally just picked up The Hollow Dead, book 4 of the Gravekeeper series, so I will be reading that and reviewing that very soon on my channel. But this, I think, came out in 2022. I think this was her big 2022 release, 2021. And I went into this being like, this is Darcy Coates. I'm going to love this book. And I almost DNF'd this. This was so hard for me to get through. I'm going to read the back real quick. Sometimes the dead reach back. Lee Harker's quiet suburban home was her sanctuary for more than a decade, until things abruptly changed. Curtains open by themselves, radios turn off and on, and a dark figure looms in the shadows of her bedroom door at night, watching her, waiting for her to finally let down her guard enough to fall asleep. Pushed to her limits but unwilling to abandon her home, Lee struggles to find answers, but each step forces her towards something more terrifying than she ever imagined. A poisonous shadow seeps from the locked door beneath the stairs. The handle rattles through the night, and fingernails scratch at the wood. Her home harbors dangerous secrets, and now that Lee is trapped within its walls, she fears she may never escape. Do you think you're safe? You're wrong. This is one of those books where Darcy Coates tried to do something a little bit different than her traditional style. And she did kind of an experimental, I would say, first third of the book to kind of allow the reader to get immersed in this world that she was creating, and to also set up kind of like the initial twist of the story. I found it extremely confusing to read. I was extremely bored pushing through it, and I just didn't understand why the first third of the story really didn't have Darcy's kind of fun, playful settings, voices, characters, and it was because she was trying something different. Now, I don't despise this book because she tried something different. I just don't think it was something that worked. And I know a lot of people do really enjoy this book, and they do really think it's scary. But it was just something for me that was a formula that I wasn't expecting. And the first third was so hard for me to get through that I barely even remember the last 2/3 of it, because I was so hyper-focused on trying to understand what I was even reading with this first third. I do remember that it still has that kind of like cozy, whimsical nature towards the end, but it was written initially in a way that just kind of felt like a low-budget indie horror film that was trying to push the envelope, but didn't kind of grab my attention. And it also didn't scare me because I was just so confused by what was going on. I also didn't connect with Lee Harker, and I usually really enjoy Darcy Coates' lead characters, but with some of her more recent releases, I have noticed that I'm struggling to connect when she's writing characters in plots that she normally doesn't write. Dead of Winter, I didn't love the main character. I also didn't love that book overall. The Haunting of Lee Harker, the same goes. And then Gallows Hill as well, even though Gallows Hill was still a little bit more towards what Darcy normally does. But I'm very happy that she's branching out just from her traditional kind of cozy haunted houses in a small town. But this one just didn't work for me. And I still love Darcy Coates. I'm still picking up every single thing that she's writing and releasing. But definitely not her normal style. So if you've only ever read this from Darcy Coates, this is definitely not what her bibliography is normally like. Okay, next up, I actually don't even have this book with me anymore. I hated it so much that I got rid of it. And that is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. If you've been on my channel before, you know that I love T. Kingfisher. She primarily writes retellings of famous Gothic short stories, most notably with The Twisted Ones, The Hollow Places, and this one as well, What Moves the Dead. And then she just recently released A House with Good Bones, which isn't a spin on a classic horror tale, but I really, really enjoyed it. So I was super excited when this came out because this is supposed to be a retelling of Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. I'm going to read the description for you. Okay. From the award-winning author of The Twisted Ones comes a gripping and atmospheric retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's classic, The Fall of the House of Usher. When Alex Easton, a retired soldier, receives word that their childhood friend Madeline Usher is dying, they race to the ancestral home of the Ushers in the remote countryside of Ruravia. What they find there is a nightmare of fungal growths and possessed wildlife surrounding a dark, pulsing lake. Madeline sleepwalks and speaks in strange voices at night, and her brother Roderick is consumed by a mysterious malady of the nerves. Aided by a redoubtable British mycologist, I think I said that wrong, and a baffled American doctor, Alex must unravel the secret of the House of Usher before it consumes them all. So I was really bummed with this because one of the things that I loved about The Twisted Ones and The Hollow Places is just how T. Kingfisher was able to modernize those stories, really, really rewrite them for a contemporary narrative, and expand upon them to take up the space of a full-length novel. They were fun, they were witty, they were creative. What Moves the Dead was set in the same kind of time period as the original Fall of the House of Usher, and really did nothing to change or elevate the story apart from adding mushroom horror to it, which I hate. I hate mushroom horror. I think it's really, really lazy. But then she also kind of created this like own culture and language to kind of tell the story as well. And in doing so, it made reading the story extremely complicated. She had, she kind of wrote a way, like a very, very creative way to explain having, like a non-binary character as a lead character back in like what would have been like the 1800s. And it was a very creative way to do it, but in doing so, T. Kingfisher created a whole slew of new pronouns that meant different things based off of different roles and preferences and age. And it was so confusing for me to follow that I just kept having to like go back and like double check what those certain pronouns meant. And I just don't understand why she didn't just set the story in the modern age, where that whole backstory wouldn't have been needed, and I feel like I would have been far more invested in the actual story and the modernization of the Fall of the House of Usher, especially now that Mike Flanagan has done the Fall of the House of Usher. You can see how well that story can translate into a contemporary tale, and this one just didn't do it for me. It really added nothing to the story in a unique and interesting way. It just kind of retold it verbatim, and then added like a couple side characters to like, you know, flesh the story out to more of a novella and less of like a short story. And I just expected and wanted more from T. Kingfisher. So I won't be reading the sequel because I just couldn't get through that book in a timely manner when I was first reading it. And I don't know, it just really didn't work for me. And I wanted so much more from her, and I love her writing normally, but I was just so confused the whole time. And I don't think her witty voice worked for that kind of time period. She's a very, very funny and kind of colloquial author, and I don't think that that type of tone worked in that type of setting, and I think she was actively trying to tone back what I love about her casual voice so much to make it fit that time period, and it just felt like it should have been set in contemporary times, and I would have had so much more fun with it. and would have gotten so much more out of like that kind of unique spin on that tale. It's a bummer because Poe is like my like favorite like classic author, and I love that story so much, and it just did not do what I was expecting from it. Okay, next up. And I do have a whole video. I have a whole video on a lot of these authors actually, but I did just do a whole video on like Anya Ahlborn as like an author spotlight where I did mention this book. But this is If You See Her, and if you watched my recent video on Anya Ahlborn, you know I adore Anya Ahlborn. Brother was my top read last year, very closely followed by The Devil Crept In. I really like Dark Across the Bay. I really like Within These Walls. It's another amazing cult story. But If You See Her, I read like right after all of those books. I like read all of those and I was like, I'm on this Anya Ahlborn kick. I just need to keep reading Anya Ahlborn. So I picked this up and it just didn't do it for me. I'm going to read the back real quick. The house on Old Mill Road has stood in an open field for longer than Jesse Wells has been alive. Its crooked windows and jutting turret tormenting the kids of Warsaw, Michigan, the way only a haunted house knows how. Everyone imagines that something terrible lurks within the house's abandoned rooms, especially Jesse and his two closest friends, Casey and Reed. But when Reed chooses the house as a backdrop for his own suicide, childhood ghost stories are transformed into a nightmare that sends Jesse into a downward spiral of grief. Nearly 20 years later, Jesse lands on the collapsing steps of the house that snatched away his best friend. Casey has asked him to revisit their old demons, if only to help them find closure that's long overdue. But tragedy finds them once more, and Jesse is left forever changed. Now left to cope with the disaster that has become his life, Jesse must unravel the mystery behind the house that has terrified him since he was a boy. To fail is to lose everything he has left, but success might come at an even higher price. Okay, so I was really, really, really excited for this. Obviously, it's Anya Ahlborn. And my only real reason for not loving this book honestly stems from the fact that it just didn't wow me the way that most of her bibliography usually does. Again, I had just finished Brother, The Devil Crept In, Within These Walls when I picked this up, and all of those books are so creepy and unique and depraved, and they have such like morally gray characters, and they prey upon our love of the family unit and how manipulating the traditional family unit can actually cause like such terror, rooted in both reality or again in like the supernatural element. And this is one of those books that while it does have that kind of element to it, it's nowhere near as poignant as her other works. And while it does have this very cool kind of creepy haunted house, I just didn't feel invested in it because I wasn't invested in our characters as much either. They just weren't very likable. And one of the things that makes Brother so good is you have somebody like Michael, who's such like you have a character like Michael who does awful, awful, awful things, but he's written about in such a likable way that you can't help but want to read more about him. I just really didn't care that much about Jesse, Casey, or Reed. I found Casey and Reed to just kind of be throwaway characters, and Jesse to me I just didn't feel concerned about in a way that I should have, and the way that I normally do with a lot of Anya Ahlborn's characters, and therefore I didn't really care what happened to him. And the actual mystery of the house kind of fell into this kind of cliche, very similar to what I just read with The Haunting of Velkwood and Gwendolyn Kiss, and it just wasn't her strongest showing. So while I didn't hate the book by any means, to me it's definitely one of the weaker of Anya Ahlborn's novels. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to talk about The Final Girls Support Group by Grady Hendrix. I love Grady Hendrix. Oh my god, do I love Grady Hendrix. I cannot stand this book. And the more I've removed myself from having read this book, the more I dislike this book, which is such a shame because my best friend's exorcism is like my favorite thing that he's ever written, and it's one of those books that I recommend all the time. And I really enjoyed Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and How to Sell a Haunted House. I thought was really, really fun, but I'm going to read the inside flap. In horror movies, the final girl is the one who's left standing when the credits roll. The one who fought back, defeated the killer, and avenged her friends. The one who emerges bloodied but victorious. But after the sirens fade and the audience moves on, what happens to her? Lynette Tarkington is a real-life final girl who survived a massacre 22 years ago, and it has defined every day of her life since. And she's not alone. For more than a decade, she's been meeting with 5 other actual final girls and their therapist in a support group for those who've survived the unthinkable, putting their lives back together piece by piece. That is until one of the women misses a meeting and Lynette's worst fears are realized. Someone knows about the group and is determined to take their lives apart again, piece by piece. But the thing about these final girls is that they have each other now, and no matter how bad the odds, how dark the night, how sharp the knife, they will never, ever give up. What I thought was really cool about this book is very much akin to Stephen Graham Jones' Indian Lake trilogy and Ex-Boogeyman by Christopher Triana, is this is Hendrix's love letter to the slasher horror genre, especially the pinnacle of like the 70s and 80s slasher films. I believe this is even set in like 2010, sort of like Ex-Boogeyman, so like the ages kind of work out. And yet, Grady Hendrix chose to focus on like all of the, he makes references consistently to all of like the big slashers, you know, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, which is actually the best thing that he does in this book is his retelling of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Halloween, Scream, like he really, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he really focuses on those stories, but our main retelling is, I believe, inspired by Silent Night, Deadly Night, which I've actually never seen, and I just thought it was so weird to have like your star characters' whole inspiration come from a very much lesser known horror movie. And because I hadn't seen it, like most of those references to it just completely went over my head, to the point that I originally thought that maybe he had come up with his own slasher to tell her story through. And then when I found out he just chose like a lesser known slasher, I was even more disappointed because I kind of wanted him to be like very creative and like write his own slasher the way that Stephen Graham Jones and Christopher Triana have done. And then I just found our main character, Lynette, to be so unbelievably unlikable that reading about her was just like pulling my hair out because I did not care about her whatsoever. I found the plot to be extremely convoluted. I felt like it never, ever, ever went anywhere that I was expecting it to go, but not in the good way. Like, it just kind of had all these moments that came out of nowhere that I was just like, I don't care. It was so unbelievable. But no, it just became extremely challenging to get through this, and I really was hoping that you would have more of like a camaraderie with the women in this book, and you really didn't. And I really wanted it to feel more like a traditional slasher story, but it really tried to be extremely meta. And at the same time, this is the least funny thing I've read from Grady Hendrix, and I've read every single one of Grady Hendrix's novels. And every single one of them, except for this one, cracks me up. He is so good at combining horror with humor, and this book just lacks all of the scariness and all of the laughs. It just completely missed every single mark that I always hold Grady Hendrix to. Like, every standard that I expect to have in a Grady Hendrix novel is completely devoid of all of that. And that's why I was very happy that How to Sell a Haunted House felt more akin to what I'm used to from Grady Hendrix, because I was really worried that if he was going to start taking more of like a serious tone with his stories, that I was going to be less and less attached to what he's going to be putting out. And I know people love Grady Hendrix. I really love Grady Hendrix. So this was obviously a huge, huge heartbreak for me. So if this is the first and only thing you've ever read by Grady Hendrix, just pick up My Best Friend's Exorcism. Pick up Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Like, he has such better books out there, and I just couldn't believe this was the same author. Like, even We Sold Our Souls, if you want something that's really going to focus on like a very, very niche thing, We Sold Our Souls is so ingrained in like 80s heavy metal, in like his like just love and adoration for 80s heavy metal, in the way that this is supposed to be ingrained in his love and adoration for slasher films. Like, that's a much better version of him, like kind of just like writing about something he's a fan of. Even though a lot of references completely went over my head, I still enjoyed that narrative. Unlike this one, where I did get a lot of the references, I just felt so lost in the story and just so uninterested in the characters. And how do you make Grady Hendrix characters boring? I just can't. This is like the worst final girl ever, is Lynette. She just sucks, and she sucks the life out of every single scene. And I finished it, and it took me so long, and I'm so used to just breezing through a Grady Hendrix novel. So there we go. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. Let me know what you guys think of this series, because I think it's definitely something really, really fun to talk about, because I've had so many people on my channel before be like, oh my god, like, I read this one book by that author, and like, I hated it, so I've never picked up anything else again. And I feel like I always try to give authors at least two reads before I determined that I don't like them. Even with like Stephen Graham Jones, I just for some reason kept reading books by him that I didn't like, and eventually I found the Indian Lake trilogy, and I love that trilogy. Cannot wait for part 3 to come out. So yeah, and as always, if you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah.